Can BigThink actually show the truth, or are they not even trying? And that's one of the many questions we're going to ask ourselves today, and find, sadly, that most people just don't care. I do, but I know I'm largely alone. Even others who say they want the truth, they're largely not being honest, or at least not across the board. They want some truths and not others. I want all of them, no matter how that makes me feel, because my feelings don't matter. So let's go take a look. We're back with the last part of the article on BigThink. Sadly, I don't think it's going to be any better than the last one was. At least, they aren't openly biased in their conclusions, but I don't think they're actually after any real conclusions at all, do you? This really seems like, well, here's both sides, make up your own mind, instead of trying to get to anything demonstrably true. Because there is an actual answer somewhere, but nobody is in any rush whatsoever to go out and find it. Far too many are just trying to straddle that line so that they don't offend anybody, and that's not me. That never has been me, never will be me. I don't care about anyone getting offended. I care about figuring out what's actually going on. So let's dive back in and see if we get any better, but I wouldn't be holding my breath. The teleological argument, also known as the argument from design. The teleological argument claims that the world's complexity proves a designer exists. Except it doesn't, because complexity is just an interpretation, not a demonstrable reality. This goes right back to, I don't get it, therefore God. But that doesn't prove that any gods are real, and certainly not any specific ones that anybody actually believes in. This is just, well, it's going to fill in this blank with an answer that I find emotionally comforting, so I'm going to just claim it's God. But that doesn't make it real. The whole thing is just a complete waste of time. But we're here, so let's look at it anyhow. The argument is, again, rather straightforward. Human-made objects were created with intention, by design, and for a purpose. And we can actually demonstrate that they were, in fact, human-designed. We can show that humans designed them, built them, and put them out there. There's no such demonstration with any gods. The universe resembles human-made objects in important ways. No, it doesn't. It looks absolutely nothing at all like that. This is interpretation, not reality. We can show that humans make stuff because we have direct, demonstrable, and repeatable examples of humans doing exactly that. We have none of that when it comes to gods. We can't even show that gods are real. This is just wishful thinking. This is what some people want to be true. But that doesn't make it true, does it? Therefore, it is probable that the universe was created with intention, by design, for a purpose. And how in the hell did you calculate that probability? Saying it's probable doesn't mean anything. What is that based on exactly, and how did you figure it out? It seems to me is not a rational answer. There is no way to even statistically calculate the odds, is there? We only have one universe to evaluate. How do we tell the difference between a universe that is designed and one that's not without more than one example to go by? And this is especially true when the religious think that everything was designed by their imaginary friend in the first place. So how do they determine what was designed and what was not designed when they have already concluded that absolutely everything is? If everything is, how do you tell the difference? They can't. This is just another question that they have absolutely no answers for, isn't it? Well, it looks designed to me. But that's not evidence that it is, in fact, designed. You have to have some kind of external methodology to determine it, and they don't have any, do they? Because they really want it to be true. That doesn't mean anything. The universe is much more complex than human-made objects. Therefore, it is probable that a powerful being designed the universe. But that's just bullshit that they yanked out of their asses. This is all just coddling of their emotional wishes and dreams, and that doesn't make any of it true. Until they can come up with some actual evidence that shows that the universe was designed by a demonstrable designer that they can provide evidence for, this is just a complete waste of everybody's time. Knock it off. This argument dates back to at least Socrates. However, the Stoic philosophers developed the argument into many forms we still see today. The Islamic philosopher Averroes endorsed it. A story about Ravi Meir makes a direct reference to it, and even Isaac Newton supported it. Now, I might have screwed up some of those names a little bit, but hey, that's life. Of course, most of those people were already religious and starting from religious preconceptions, so of course they accepted something that made their existing religious beliefs look more valid. But that doesn't make any of it actually true. That's why I tell people that they need to go back to step one and justify their beliefs all the way down. Take faith completely out of the picture because your faith doesn't mean anything. Now, sometimes that's not possible. We all have to agree that we just exist and share a real world before we can even have a coherent conversation about anything else. But the religious have to do the same thing, so they've got nothing to complain about here. I always thought it funny when solipsists insist that they're the only ones that are real, be they a brain in a vat or whatever, yet they're the ones out there playing make-believe contact with non-existent minds, doing things on a non-existent internet, stuff like that, trying to rationalize their own beliefs to entities that they don't even think are real. It just makes you roll your eyes at the irony. Yeah, but whatever. Anyhow, but the most famous version of it was put forward by William Paley in his Watchmaker analogy. He imagines what we would say if we had to explain how a watch we found on the ground got there. As he puts it, the inference we think is inevitable, that the watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed at some time and in some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer. And I'm sorry, but Paley isn't anybody you should hold up as a great defender of your faith. Even in Paley's own time, people were pointing out just how dumb the Watchmaker argument was. And I've done that before, so there's no real reason to do it again. But I will address the last bit, where he said that we must have a maker, and then he just leaps to, well, that maker's God, which of course he did, and theists have been doing the exact same thing since the advent of religion. Just because you really want your God to be true, that doesn't mean that your God is true. Just because you really want your God to have done it, it doesn't mean your God done it. And that's why I keep asking, how do you know that? And I just watch them squirm as they realize that they have no coherent answer. I am not now, nor will I ever be interested in what you believe. I don't care what you have faith in. I care only what you can demonstrate to me with demonstrable evidence. And if you can't demonstrate any of it to me, then you've got no business believing in it yourself. Your faith is entirely empty. And that's not really much of a surprise, is it? Of the arguments for the existence of a God, this one has perhaps the greatest connection to the parts of our lives outside of philosophy. It asks us to consider the world's beauty, the depths of the mysteries of nature, the intricacies of the environment, and what those mean for how we understand the world and how it came to be. And this is the worst example of, I don't get it, therefore God. It's why all of this is such a complete waste of time. Just because you don't understand it, that doesn't mean God done it. Now, it's fine to look at the world and wonder. That's healthy to at least a certain degree. Yet, until you have any actual evidence for how it happened, the only coherent, rational answer you can give is, I don't know. God done it isn't a rational answer unless you have evidence that God actually done it. So let us know when you have some, and I don't think we should be holding our breath, But the religious have none, and they don't actually care, do they? And I still find it funny watching the religious whine, but we care, when it's demonstrable that they don't. If they cared, then they would put their beliefs to the test. They would set aside faith as I did, and they would go out and see what the real evidence actually shows. Because if their beliefs are true, then the real evidence should point directly and demonstrably to those beliefs. But they don't want to do that, do they? I believe it isn't enough. It isn't even close. Yet, how many theists have the balls to actually put their beliefs to the test? Not a lot, right? And the ones that do, they don't stay theists for long. Beautiful as that thought is, the teleological argument has still earned its detractors. As David Hume noted, this world is far from perfect, and if a deity made it, then that deity must be an inferior one. He also asserted that we cannot say if this universe is well designed, as we haven't seen any others. Voltaire pointed out that the designer in this argument doesn't have to be a god. Meanwhile, other thinkers have argued that the analogy between man-made objects and the entirety of reality is invalid. And all of those are perfectly adequate points, which I've already made. It's why I don't get it, therefore God is a completely pointless statement, yet it is what most of the classical philosophical arguments depend on. There must have been something, and that thing must have been my God. Yeah, but those are two entirely separate questions, aren't they? Just because you get emotional comfort from thinking it's your God, that doesn't make it your God or any God whatsoever. It's why I insist that they walk me through the steps, the rational steps, not based on faith or fifis, to make sure that they're not just leaping over a couple in their mad dash towards religious confirmation bias. Because they all are. Show me exactly how you got there, because therefore God means nothing unless you have demonstrated that your God is verifiably real. It doesn't matter what you want to be true. It doesn't matter what you have faith in. It matters what you can show actually is. Get to work. So on to the next one. Russell's teapot. One of the more whimsical arguments against the existence of any gods was put forward by Bertrand Russell. And like any number of the British aristocracy in good standing, the third Earl Russell invoked tea in his argument. This is the one that the religious just don't understand. I think that's pretty much on purpose. I have seen them pretend that atheists actually think there's a teapot circling Mars or whatever. I have seen them claim that we have faith that there's a teapot out there. No, that's not how this works. The whole point of the argument is to show that faith is completely pointless, meaningless, utterly useless. If you can't show that there is a teapot, then believing that there is a teapot is utterly idiotic. Just as if you can't show that there is a God, then believing that there is a God, it's just dumb. Yet this is what beliefs in God are based on in almost all circumstances, aren't they? You just have to have faith. No, you don't. You absolutely shouldn't. You should never, ever, ever have faith, at least not the Hebrews 11:1 variety. Yet, it does get worse, doesn't it? He asked his readers to suppose that he was seriously advancing the idea of a teapot floating in orbit around the sun. This teapot is also impossible to detect. The question then, is it on you to disprove the impossibility of this teapot's existence, or is it his responsibility to prove that it's real? Yet we see theists all the time saying that somehow it's our job to prove their imaginary friends aren't real, right? It's not their job to prove that their gods exist. They have faith, and that just means it has to be true. We have to prove them wrong, and then, like people like William Lane Craig and Ken Ham said, even if we could, they'd still believe it because they have the witness of the Holy Spirit or whatever bullshit Craig makes up in his head, so he can sleep better at night. People do not understand the basic burden of proof. They really don't. They just go with what they want to be true, and since it would be emotionally uncomfortable to admit that they might not be right, They simply double down on their own fee-fees and faith and pretend that they just can't be wrong. Any positive claim bears the burden of proof, even for mundane claims. Now, whoever you're making the claim to, they might not call for your evidence, but that doesn't mean that you're not responsible for defending it if they do. If you say that you have a dog, that's a very mundane claim. Tons of people have dogs, we know dogs are real, but I don't have to accept your claim without comment. I can insist to see pictures of your dog. I could ask you to trot your dog out. If you want me to believe you, then it is solely on your own shoulders to produce that evidence that I'm asking for. Otherwise, I have no reason at all to believe that you're telling the truth. I don't have to believe you. Now, you might not care if I believe you. That's another thing entirely. But the burden of proof comes from me. I impose that on you. You don't get to pick it for yourself. That's not how that works. Now, that doesn't mean that you're wrong if I say, prove it to me, and you don't. It just means that you have failed to justify and validate your claims to me. And that's why I don't play the extraordinary claims thing necessarily. It goes for all claims, not just extraordinary ones. It's just that with most ordinary claims, people aren't usually going to call you out on it, but they certainly could, and your responsibility is if they do. The responsibility to answer all objections with evidence is yours, not mine. If nobody asks, then you probably don't have to present the evidence, but you still should be able to regardless. If the person claiming to have the dog lives in a strict Muslim majority country where having dogs is incredibly rare because they're sinful or whatever the fuck it is, then it's no longer an ordinary claim, is it? I damn well will be asking you to back it up, and if you don't, I'm not going to believe you. That's how it actually works. Russell's point was that anyone making such a claim is the one who must prove it, not the person objecting to it. And since nobody takes arguments of a spacefaring teapot seriously, why then should we treat other arguments as sacred? Perhaps the greatest legacy of the argument is that its use as a tool to remind users where the burden of proof lies when the assertion is made. And if you're not into tea, Carl Sagan once made a similar point about the impossible to detect dragon living in his garage. There are lots of examples, and the religious will be perfectly happy with all of them, except their own gods. This is why I point out that we do not need and should never accept double standards. One standard for everything, that's really all we need. So long as everything is equivalent, then playing these ridiculous word games should never be accepted. And that's where a lot of people, especially when it comes to faith, go horribly awry. It's why I take faith off the table immediately. If you can't justify your positions without blind faith, then you've got no business believing it in the first place. The relevance of this analogy to existing religions has been debated. One common objection is that it would be difficult to hide the evidence of sending a teapot to space. Another is that while no reasonable person is arguing that a star-trekking teapot exists, there are reasonable people who maintain that there is a God. Except I don't really think that there are. There are people who want to be seen as reasonable who maintain that there is a God, but it doesn't mean any of them are actually reasonable, because actually reasonable people don't take ridiculous, unreasonable positions. I'm sure that the people who pretend that the earth is flat, they want to be seen as reasonable too, although most people would disagree. I'm sure that the people that think they've seen Bigfoot, they want to be seen as reasonable too. Same thing applies. Wanting to be reasonable and being reasonable, those are two entirely different things. Just asserting that you're reasonable doesn't make you reasonable. And the same thing goes with rationality. That's why we have standards to begin with, so that we can gauge those claims against those standards to see if they stand up. We don't care about your fee-fees, and we don't care about your faith. And as we know, that's all most of these people are concerned with. So, no, I don't think it's reasonable or rational to claim that any gods exist, at least not until demonstrable evidence has been presented to show that they actually do. If you can't come up with that and yet still believe, then you've got some issues. And that's your problem, not ours. Finally, we get to the last argument, which sadly is equally unimpressive. The ontological argument. Our last argument is certainly the most abstract. It is also, perhaps, both the most interesting from a philosophical point of view and the easiest to dismiss as ridiculous. As René Descartes put it, if there is a God, it is a perfect being. Really? Says who? Because there are certainly a lot of gods that have been proposed over the years that are not described at all as being perfect. Pretty much nothing in the Greek or Roman pantheons are even close. They are all capricious, jealous deities with all the same foibles as humans because, humans just made them up, just like all the gods. And if you look at the Abrahamic God, you've got the same failings. Exodus 34:14, which says that God is a jealous God. Well, that's not a perfect being. The Bible is full of God throwing childish temper tantrums, committing mass murder, demanding worship, etc., etc., etc. These are not signs of a perfect God. So Descartes was just wrong on that one, and just like he was wrong on a lot of other things in my opinion. But let's continue. A perfect being possesses all possible perfections. Again, says who? Because we've already done away with the whole perfect being thing, at least as it applies to the Abrahamic God, and it pretty much goes for all gods anyway. This just shows that the religious aren't referencing a real demonstrable being. They're just following around the made-up images that they have in their heads, and this is incredibly common. How do you know that? Needs to be asked a whole lot more here, and sadly, most people don't push it nearly as far as they should. Absolutely nothing should be accepted without evidence, which is one reason the religious don't really want to talk to us, because we ask too many hard questions. However, that aside, onward. Existence is a perfection. Again, says who? Because I can do this all day. There's a difference between assertions and facts. Just because Descartes wanted existence to be a perfection, that doesn't mean that it is. This is really where philosophy tends to go off the cliff a lot, because it's based on assertions with no defensible way to back any of it up. That's why it's filled with warring camps. Well, it sounds good to me. What difference does that make? It doesn't sound good to us. I mean, this whole thing is stupid. Who cares? If we're after fact, which we should be, then taking individual wishes and dreams out of the picture, that has to be on the first of our list of things to do. I don't care how you feel. I don't care what you like. I don't care what you wish was true. I don't care about your faith. I care what you can demonstrate in the real world that we have all basically agreed exists. Besides, existence isn't a characteristic that you can just randomly assign to something. Either a thing actually exists or it doesn't. It's not a perfect thing. It's a real thing, and it needs to be demonstrable. Invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies are perfect, thus they need to exist. But that doesn't make them real, does it? The whole thing is just idiotic. Therefore, God necessarily possesses the quality of existence, which is still not how that works. This is a really dumb one, and sadly, it's not really any worse than anything else the religious have to say. So let's just get into the justification, because I don't think they're going to be any better than what we've already seen. This is based on a similar argument advanced by St. Anselm. Avicenna made a related argument in the Islamic world, and the ancient Greek poet-philosopher Xenophanes authored similar ideas in some of the oldest extant philosophy, and in his younger years, Bertrand Russell was convinced by this argument, though, as you've probably guessed, he later rejected it. But see, it doesn't matter who suggested it, or liked it, or disliked it. All of that is utterly irrelevant to reality. I get so sick and tired of people tossing names around going, but this person said so. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who said it. It only matters if it's true. An argument works, or doesn't work, solely based on its own merits, not on who might have thought it up, or who might have thought it was a good idea, or whatever else. Far too many people get into this kind of absurd hero worship, and that just pisses me off. I don't care about Anselm or Aquinas or anybody else. Throwing names around doesn't make the arguments any better or any worse. Can we just stop that, please? Defend the argument on its own merits. I don't need a history lesson. I don't care. The primary counterargument is that existence is not part of the concept of something, a quality or a predicate. This approach was first formulated by Immanuel Kant, a Christian himself. Russell came to agree with Kant, although he still found the original argument to be well structured. And he's still doing it. Knock it off. None of this actually matters. Structure doesn't mean anything. And this is why I get sick and tired of people arguing over structure. Oh, but my syllogism is valid. I don't care. I care if it's true. I care if it is sound logically, rationally, and evidentially. Structure doesn't mean anything. It might make it a little bit easier to understand and break down, but it has nothing at all to do with whether or not it's true. St. Thomas Aquinas objected to Anselm's version of the argument, as it more explicitly requires us to understand the essence of God. If this is impossible, as he and many subsequent thinkers maintained, this argument can't possibly prove anything. In modern times, William Rowe suggests that the argument presupposes the existence of God. And, of course, this too is meaningless as well. Aquinas disagreed with Anselm because he didn't like the consequences. He liked his version of God, but not Anselm's version of God. But since neither of them are demonstrably real, who cares? This is where we have these problems, and we do have these problems a lot. Your faith and your fifis mean nothing. But we see these criticisms constantly. But that's not what God is like. Well, how the hell do you know that? I didn't ask you what you believed. I didn't ask about your faith. I asked you how you know. What can you demonstrate is actually true in the real world that we all share? And of course, they don't have any answers for that, do they? Yet they should, you'd think. They should have answers, and we need to hold them accountable for having those answers and showing us how they got there. And until they do have those answers, all the arguments that they make are going to continue to fail time and time again. Because at the end of the day, if we're not getting to truth, then we're just wasting our time. And I don't mean, well, it sounds good to me. I don't mean I really like it. I mean actual, demonstrable, factual, evidentially validated, true for absolutely everybody in the real world that we all share truth. If you're not doing that, if you're not after that, then you are an idiot. If you're only after your own personal emotional comfort, then you are an idiot. And for a ton of people, religious and non-religious alike, they don't actually care about the truth, do they? They're just looking to coddle their own fifis and feel better about their position in what can be a scary world. But I don't care about that. Not remotely. It's why all of these articles that we look at fail, because they aren't actually looking for the fundamental foundation of verifiable reality. And that's verifiable reality, because they don't care. The second that anyone doesn't care, as we pretty much know most people don't, they've lost. I'm really tired of talking to losers. Most people out there are. Losers, I mean, and I find that immensely sad, don't you?